now that we have our NPCs in here, we'd like for our character to be able to interact with them. And there's a number of things we want to happen when that interaction occurs, right? Ultimately, if you remember back to that first video in this playlist, a speech bubble pops up and there's well, it's a copy of questions from a quiz in a class I taught recently, but it's sort of a conversation occurs between our character and the NPC. So there's quite a bit to happen, and oftentimes in programming there's a lot that we want to do, but trying to do it all at once is just going to overwhelm us. So we want to do it little pieces at a time along the way. So the first little piece is just to make sure we can get a collision to happen. Just make sure the computer detects the collision. And then we'll come back and expand that in later steps. Always want to break it down and do little pieces at a time when programming. Otherwise, the entire thing is just going to overwhelm you. So here, we set our character and all the NPCs up to have collisions. So maybe a good test to see if that happens would be just delete the other character when a collision happens. That'll give us a way to check and make sure we're detecting the collisions. And then we'll come back and adjust that, because ultimately we don't want to delete them, but that's a quick, easy way to check it. Another common way would just be to echo something back to our console. Since we'll be looking at the scene, I was thinking that, well, deleting the NPC whenever an interaction occurs would be a quick visual check to see what happens. So, question we have to ask is, where are we going to put this script? So thus far, if I look over at the scripts we have, in the macros folder we have two scripts so far. We have a camera controller and a player controller. And the interaction is always going to occur between our player and one of the NPCs. So we could create a new script. I'm just going to go ahead and put it in this player controller script we have. So I'll select that and then bring that up here. And I'll go ahead and maximize this so that we have more room to work with. So thus far, we set up the two events that I mentioned we always want to have. We always want a start event to initialize things, and we always want an update event. We always have to worry about those two things in every script. But those aren't the only two events that could happen. There's other events, for example, collision events. So we have a flow from our update event, and there might or might not be a collision. So instead of checking that in this flow, let's just add an event for a collision. So if we right click to bring up the fuzzy finder and check for collision. When we look for collision, it searches through and it looks like it's finding a whole lot of stuff. Oh, so here's some collision events. So we can see all of these are in the events. So we have on collision exit. So that means after we collide and we're leaving the collision. So after we're finished with it. On collision stay. So when we collide and we stay right there next to the thing. On collision enter. This is probably the easiest one to check. So that means enter as soon as the collision starts. So those three are the three alternatives for it. And then we have 2D versions. We're in a 2D game, so we have enter, the start of the collision, stay during the collision, and exit at the end of the collision. So let's do it at the beginning. So on collision, and notice the color coding. The green on our start and update event, and then green for our collision event. So just a couple things to check here. Well, first off, we can see here what this applies to. It applies to the self, and we're putting this in the player controller script, so self refers to the player. So it'll be between a collision and some other collider, this second node here. But let's see what we can find about that other collider. What information can we pull about it? So if we come over here, the first prediction is collider 2D. And the first prediction again will be exposed collider 2D. So that'll tell us everything about that collision that happened. So is it enabled? active, density, a whole bunch of information. Like I said, a quick way to check and make sure the collision works is going to be just to delete the other one. So all we really need is what is the other game object that we collided with. So if we drag this out, then we should be able to just delete that other game object. So if we look for delete, oh, well, it's not under delete. So it's actually under the word destroy. That's oriented programming. Since there's a lot of stuff involved, the standard term will be destroy rather than delete. So we have a couple things. So component destroy. I think this second one's the one we want. So the first one, notice we have a prediction down at the bottom of the search bar. It says it removes a game object, component, or asset, and then those two arguments, the nodes that we have to hook up to, are the object to destroy, which that's what we grabbed from the collider, exposed collider there, and T is the amount of time to delay before destroying an object. Well, this is just a test. We're going to replace this with something else later, so we don't need a delay. This second one down will just destroy the object we collided with. So when a collision happens, when the computer detects a collision event between our player character, the self, and whatever it collided with, we're going to take the other object it collided with and destroy it. Then we just need to connect the flow so that this is what happens immediately after the collision. So let's see if that works. It's already in the script for the player, so it's connected to our player object, and it should work. So let's give this a test. So here we are back in our game, and it's running now. We can move around. We see the other NPCs there. So when a collision happens, oh, it immediately erased that other NPC. So it is detecting the collision correct. Notice how it's moving a little funny now. I could probably slow that speed down. And whenever I run into one, somehow it got twisted around at a different angle. Somehow these collisions are affecting the physics. So it's still, the physics engine's trying to apply. So it looks like all the collisions work, but let's address that little problem with the physics engine. And then, so we know the collisions detect. Destroy is not actually what we want there, but trying to think about everything we want to happen in that collision all at once and do it all at the same time would just be overwhelming and an awful lot to test, right? We'd have all kinds of stuff happening. So if we put it all together and then tried to run it and it didn't work, it would be too much to check. So I always want to check in small pieces. One thing I did notice is the player object tried to spin around whenever it bumped into something. So the physics is applying to it. So for the rigid body, under constraints, how is it constrained? Well, we can freeze position, so we can set the X and Y position so it doesn't move, or the second option, freeze rotation. So that's the problem. Whenever it bumps into something, it's detecting that bump and knocking it off center. So we don't want it to be able to rotate. So we'll just expand constraints on the rigid body component and freeze rotation. So let's check and see if that fixed that problem. And an important thing to remember for those who are new to programming is never, ever, ever try to fix more than one problem at a time. Programs become very connected, and if we notice two problems, they could actually be just issues arising from the same problem. So when we fix one, it actually fixes the other. So if we tried to address them both at the same time, we end up creating a new problem. So Never try to fix more than one problem at a time. If you notice 2 or 3 problems, fix the first one, test that fix, then come back and test the next one. Okay, so I hand it way off center. It didn't spin the character, and we can tell those collisions are being detected. So that seems like that step's working. We're detecting our collisions, and in the next tutorial we'll do something more interesting than just erase the other character.